hosts the largest annual event for green building professionals worldwide. Attendees learn and source solutions to improve resilience, sustainability, and quality of life in our buildings, cities, and communities. In 2022, Greenbuild is taking place in San Francisco, California, and celebrating its 20th anniversary.
Welcome, everyone, to ESG Decoded. I'm Amanda Hsieh, and today I have with me Colley Hodges from the Houston Zoo. Hi, Colley.
Hey, Amanda. Good to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for making time for talking to us. I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about conservation, about being a mission-driven organization, and how that really gets embedded into the organization and just kind of trickles down, and just some cool stuff that the zoo is doing. Anyways, before we start, tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the Houston Zoo for those folks that I've been since I was a kid, but for the folks that don't know, please tell them a little bit.
My pleasure. So I've been since I was a kid too. I'm a native Houstonian, so grew up in Houston, went to school here, and studied I studied creative writing and literature before I got into architecture, and made most of my career as an architect. Before I joined the zoo, I worked as a director of sustainability for Hsieh Architecture, which is a local architecture firm, one of the kind of larger firms here in Texas. So directed their sustainability program, and then joined the zoo. So architect by training, but kind of been involved with sustainability for going on about 10 years now. And then, joined the zoo. Happy to be kind of shifting from the corporate world to the nonprofit world, which has been kind of fun, and to plug right into the zoo's mission.
The second part of I want to tell everyone more about the zoos. Yeah. What is the mission of the Houston Zoo?
Yeah, okay. So, our mission is to connect communities to animals in order to inspire action to save wildlife. And there's kind of an even simpler statement of that you can see over our front gate when you walk in, which is see them, save them. So our whole mission is to give people the opportunity to fall in love with animals and to be a part of saving wildlife. And basically the way that they're doing that is every dollar we collect ends up going towards conservation and saving animals, both locally and worldwide. So happy to get into more of that. There's some local species that are alive because of the work of the Houston Zoo, and we have partnerships across the world with other conservation organizations. But I can also tell you, the zoo's 100 years old, so we're celebrating our centennial this year.
Wow.
So, April was our birthday, 100 years. We're kind of continuing to celebrate that throughout the rest of the year with some special events. But started 100 years ago in Herman Park with one animal, a bison named Earl, and kind of slowly grew. That fence around Earl expanded, and the zoo kind of followed the boom and bust cycles of Houston. Periods where there were a lot more growth and more animals, and then slower, times. And then the biggest recent development, the zoo privatized in the early 2000s and is now run by a nonprofit on land owned by the city, the support of the city and the local donor community. And really since then, the zoo has changed tremendously. Most of the zoo has been rebuilt since the early 2000s. So we always say anyone who hasn't been to the zoo in a little while in Houston, they're in for see a lot that's changed, and there's a lot that's new.
It's time to go back and revisit it, right? If you're like us and last time you went was a long time, or less like me, last time you went was when you were a teenager.
You should come back.
Tell me about, with that mission guiding the zoo and the organization, how do you see that working into, let's say, the growth strategy at the zoo?
I'll say that mission to save wildlife it filters down into every aspect of the zoo. So I'll start with that. I'm really, honestly, even the people, everyone that works at the zoo, I think buys into that mission, that kind of moral charge to be, stewards of the environment and animals. And people who work with animals are just fun, cool people to work around. But we've codified this idea of saving animals as part of our mission, and sustainability in particular as a part of our strategic plan. So it's part of what's guiding our physical growth. And we have certain challenges. We're a kind of a landlocked zoo surrounded by Herman Park, Texas Medical Center. So that kind of leads to certain sustainable growth strategies. But sticking with that idea of how the mission to save animals filters down, it goes down into your experience as a guest. No one wants to miss out on seeing their favorite animal or something, but probably if you're not seeing your favorite animal, they're off exhibit, it could be because their welfare is the priority in that moment. They're getting a checkup. If you're coming in the middle of a hot day in Houston, they have access to their bedroom, and their choice whether to go out on exhibit. So that mission filters down into everything that happens, from the keepers to the way that we physically are developing our buildings and our campus as a whole, and trying to minimize our environmental impacts as we do that. And it even filters down into very small kind of decisions. So I don't want to keep circling back to architecture the whole time like we have this conversation, but as the architect, I think a lot about what we're building and how the built environment reflects that mission. And there's some interesting examples of it. Like one of our award-winning exhibits is our Texas Wetlands exhibit, which is right in the heart of the zoo. This fantastic exhibit, and one of the features of that is there's a wooden boardwalk that kind of weaves throughout the exhibit. And this happened before I joined the zoo, so I'll relay the story as best as I understand it. But in the design of that exhibit, we are carefully considering what type of wood to use, and with our architects and designers had determined to use a South American hardwood called Hsieh, which is super resilient and tough, fungal resistant and pest resistant and everything. Great for that kind of outdoor application with sun and water. And we actually had the understanding that it was sustainably harvested Hsieh, so certified by the Forest Stewardship Council, which is this kind of leading sustainable forestry standard. After the exhibit was completed, we actually had some of our partners from the South American Pantanal on campus walking around, and they noticed our use of Hsieh. And you would think that this is kind of the end of the story where we use the sustainably harvested Hsieh. We had to see people that could see that we use the sustainably harvested wood. But actually their feedback was that they said, regardless of whatever certification you have, whatever you think the sourcing of this material is, we have this kind of insight that because we live there, that it's very difficult to actually sustainably harvest Hsieh. So that really stuck out to us and led us to do some more research and to actually come up with our own set of sustainable wood purchasing standards. And we've shifted to using equally kind of resilient but different woods on future projects because of our confidence in its sourcing and less impacts on wildlife. So even a fairly minor decision, you would think in the context of one particular thing that we're building, led to this opening this whole can of worms of what really is the best choice and most consistent with our mission as an organization. So even the smallest material selection is something that mission filters down to.
Thank you for sharing that story. I think that's so interesting that, you did your due diligence, and this happens. And I worked in supply chain for a long time, doing a lot of due diligence, working on supply chain sustainability, and you discover something, you can't ignore the fact anymore, right? And that's our jobs then in sustainability is right. I've heard this, let's dig in a little bit further, right? Because again, we have that mission that guides us, and we want to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And we want to make sure we are doing the right thing.
Yeah, you're totally right. And there's, there's more examples I can kind of give on that. On the operations side, we're an organization that has to consume resources. We have to use energy and water to be, to function. We have to accept that we're likely to produce some form of waste. So all of those things, again, going through that lens of what's the most sustainable way to operate ourselves and shrink our footprint in order to save animals in the wild and not encroach on habitat, not consume resources in ways that contribute to climate change and all its impacts on wildlife. So with something like, how do we with our business partners run our restaurants and gift shops and sell things and serve food? So that we've actually changed kind of the way that we operate related to single-use plastics in both our restaurants and our retail over the last 5 or 6 years. And again, happy to get more into that if you're interested. But that's another example where there's one particular kind of small aspect of our operation that we understand that it can have potentially large impacts on wildlife. So we take the time and effort to change it.
I think the question for me is there's so many things you can do at the zoo. There's so many opportunities. How do you prioritize or decide what to do, now versus later? And, does that does the mission of the zoo play into that decision making? Because there's, like you said, we have any operation is going to have multiple environmental impacts, and we can't do everything at once, even though we wish we could just snap our fingers and do it overnight. Maybe talk a little bit about that. How do you select? How do you decide? And I mean, I think it's so interesting to hear about how the zoo takes responsible sourcing, whether it's the wood, whether it's kind of the products or the utensils that it's, or, packaging it's offering, or through its vendors offering at the gift shops and restaurants. But I'm just thinking there's, you mentioned, being as efficient as possible, saving energy and addressing, climate impacts. But how do you sort through all that and decide and prioritize?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so being a nonprofit, obviously we're dependent on money that we can raise and on revenue from the support of people who are attending the zoo. So there's a lot of hands in those pots. I mean, I guess due respects, obviously Houston has an amazing community as far as philanthropy, and there's a lot of organizations that are worth receiving that money, but also with the planning that we do each year. And this is something that I'm only involved in kind of on the periphery, so I'll just explain it from my perspective. There's this kind of set of priorities of trying to keep up with world-class exhibits that are still using resources efficiently, trying to deal with a 100-year-old zoo with aging infrastructure. So there's plenty of opportunity to prioritize that and money that could be spent there. But it's kind of a balancing act, I think, and it might actually kind of get back to what I was saying, where there's certain kind of seemingly small investments and moves that have large impacts. So I'll stay with the single-use plastics example. I mean, because it's a really good one. Where about 5 years ago, we looked at phasing out plastic water bottles on our campus, and after that, looked at plastic bags, straws, and lids, and all this because single-use plastics often end up disposed of improperly and end up in bodies of water and can harm wildlife. And most recently, just this year, we had a real win, a real success, which was phasing out single-use plastic packaging in all of our stores with the help of our culinary retail partner, SSA Group. So that was again, these are all they seem like kind of small things that operationally they take a lot of planning and intervention on the supply chain, and SSA did the lion's share of the work on that, which was really amazing. They reached out to their suppliers and basically said, you have this plastic in your product as far as packaging, and can you explore alternatives? Otherwise, we're in jeopardy of not selling your product. So it seemed like kind of a lot of research and kind of small moves, but then those have big impacts down the line. And it's also that chance for us, kind of getting back to your point about being a mission-driven organization, it's a chance for us to live out our values, even in kind of the smallest moments in the zoo. So our typical guest might not even notice that there's a difference in our retail stores, and that's a good thing.
Right.
Yeah, but we've done that work and eliminated that plastic packaging. First zoo in the U.S. to have done that, and we're hoping that there will be a ripple effect that other zoos will have the really be a good part of the way there, because SSA does service other zoos. So it's leading and allowing that mission to kind of drive even real small decisions, and something that might be a minor part of the guest experience, but that means a lot to us. Yeah.
What I think about is that even though it might be something small by weight or by volume, right? But because multiply it by the number of visitors you have and guests you have, which is huge, it actually makes a really big impact. And as you mentioned, you're the first zoo to do this. Hopefully inspires others, zoos and similar spaces, and it kind of leads the way and shows that it's possible, but also there's a demand for it. I think part of being that leader in the market is signaling to your suppliers, your vendors, hey, we're interested in this.
Right.
We don't know exactly how to do it, but we're interested, and can we get there together?
You're totally right.
And someone has to give that initial signal of, I'm interested, we're interested.
Yeah, just asking the question. And there's interesting ways to, which I've seen this in the green building world, that just kind of asking for information related to chemical ingredients related to other life cycle impacts. You know, I know you have some interest in embodied carbon and that side on materials. So sometimes just asking the question prompts the manufacturers kind of to do the right thing. But you're right. I mean, the coolest thing about our plastics reduction, and particularly the plastic packaging, is that impact at scale, because we're the second most visited zoo in the country. And even though there are aquariums and other organizations that have done similar stuff, you know, being the first actual zoo, you know, to do this, again, there's that chance for that ripple effect, which, you know, is pretty cool.
It's very cool. You talked about conservation of wildlife locally and afar. Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, I can give a couple. So there's two species that you won't actually see at the zoo. They're not featured in exhibits, but that back of house, the zoo, through breeding programs, has basically reestablished in the wild. Those two species are the Atwater's prairie chicken and the Houston toad. And
I didn't mean to make that face. I just didn't know we had a toad, but thank you. Now I do.
Right. And neither of those species, those local species, would be alive without the work of the Houston Zoo. So that's an example of, you know, kind of a behind the scenes, but clearly, you know, a wildlife saving action that your dollars are funding if, you know, when you buy a membership or a ticket to the zoo. Worldwide, we have a number of other partnerships. We have 40 plus partnerships in 20 plus countries, and those are saving all kinds of wildlife, from tapirs in South America to gorillas and lions in Africa and Asia. So there's you know, that's that impact both locally and worldwide that we have as a conservation-driven organization, and that's where our focus is as far as the dollars that we collect from the donor community and from folks who visit the zoo.
You know, one of the reasons I was really excited about this conversation today is because there is this, I think, renewed focus on protecting biodiversity and protecting nature. It is something that, of course, is impacted by climate change. There's definitely intersections with that and connected to, you know, combating climate change, but it's also has its own set of issues too. And I think it's something that we're becoming more aware of, the just importance to protect nature and restore, you know, in certain areas, nature and biodiversity. And that's why I'm excited to talk to you and hear a little bit about the zoo and how the mission really just trickles down through all of it, and what the kind of the highlights of the work you're doing. And I have a few other podcasts scheduled up also talking about green infrastructure, so maybe from your past world, but really kind of exploring this idea of how do we talk a lot about climate change, and of course that's, you know, hugely important and we need to address it, but there's also other global, I think, environmental challenges like biodiversity loss and plastic pollution that we need to address as well.
And they're interconnected. I think that's such an important thing, like to emphasize. So, you know, from what I've seen, again, I've only been at the zoo for a year, so still kind of new to the zoo world. But there's not a lot of zoos that have talked openly and explicitly kind of about climate change and crafting a sustainability action plan around climate change. So it's something that we're kind of, you know, I think looking at. But those trickle down effects of climate change that end up impacting habitat, you know, everything. We have a kind of a zoo culture, like staff training that everyone goes through, and I always bring up sea turtles as this kind of unofficial ambassador of sustainability at the Houston Zoo. And we have sea turtles as kind of a concrete species that you're saving through a lot of our take action messages throughout the zoo related to plastics and other things. But sea turtles are this like especially vulnerable species to climate change. As you get warmer oceans that change currents, you know, they move food sources, introduce new predators that sea turtles aren't used to encountering. You have stronger storms that cause devastation to sea turtle habitats. As you have sea level rise, that does the same kind of thing. So even, you know, in doing some research, I'm not a sea turtle expert, by the way, but I didn't know this, but actually the sex of sea turtles is determined by the temperature of the sand that their eggs are laid in. So warmer sand means a shortage of male sea turtles. So there's all these kind of trickle down effects, and that's just one species. I mean, you could find similar kind of implications for any species. Yeah, you're right. It's that trickle down effects into habitat biodiversity that are kind of less talked about, and in some ways more concrete. Maybe I mean maybe it's an opportunity to kind of shift some messaging, because I think climate change is still relatively an esoteric concept to some people.
It's as you mentioned, it's more concrete, it's more tangible, right? Because we see the wildlife, we can see the loss of biodiversity, whether it's with our own eyes or whether it's satellite scans of, different natural regions. Nowadays, we can see it. It's much easier to feel.
Yeah.
than climate changes may or may not be. Of course, we live in Houston, so I feel like we feel the effects a little bit more with whether it's different types of storms, whether it's Winter Storm Uri or it's hurricanes or just more wet, a little bit too much water, not enough water, whatever. Where this is Houston.
Right, it is, and the zoo has kind of had to ride those challenges, and we thought that hurricane preparation, was potentially the biggest, natural disaster that we had to have, a plan for and be resilient under the effects of. But then you get winter storms that cause, these massive freezes, and that's been interesting. There's some great stories and photos of the zoo, during Harvey, during Winter Storm Uri, and the way that everyone really kind of came together and did what had to be done to keep our animals safe during those times. There's a lot that could be said on that, but we had really, I think, a lot of success in keeping our animals comfortable and safe during some of those moments. And allegedly, there's an internal story from the zoo of Lee Imke, our president, being like waist deep in the water around our koi pond, fishing out koi from our iconic reflecting pond and at the entry to the zoo. So yeah, everyone really kind of came together during those events. Again, I'm relaying just stories that I've heard before I joined the zoo. So there's better people who could tell these stories with more detail.
But that mission runs deep.
It does, yeah, it definitely does. It's so interesting too. It's a chance to talk about this kind of, the mission of zoos has really changed over the years, and we've lived a change being a 100-year-old zoo. But zoos, of the past, they were recreation, they were destinations for recreation mainly, and animals were presented as novelties. I mean, it was a menagerie of animals in cages and sometimes depressing conditions, and generally kind of taxonomically displayed. So, all the monkeys here, all the reptiles here, all the big cats here, and modern zoos have changed both in the mission, to where you've shifted to, instead of being just purely recreational, destination. I mean, obviously, we still have the recreational side and still have the educational side, but having that saving wildlife as a primary mission. And again, I'm interested in how you can actually kind of see the built environment of zoos change along with that mission changing. So now modern zoo exhibits are really these immersive exhibits where you're seeing animals that actually exist together symbiotically in the wild. You're trying to, the landscape reflects the region that you're trying to capture. So you're really much more being immersed in a real functioning ecosystem rather than kind of this observer that's looking at an animal in captivity. And we have some good examples of that in the exhibits that we've built in the last just few years. We in our team, in fact, as an aside, we were just recently passing around an article in the Atlantic that was published in the 1980s. It was kind of articulating this change. It was starting to happen in the 80s, but they had a designer who was interviewed, and he was in the process of trying to design a more immersive exhibit, and though it was a primate exhibit. And what he described was, he said, instead of thinking about how I was going to design a gorilla exhibit, I thought about how you inverse the problem. I basically said, how can I design a landscape that a gorilla would be in? And I think that really kind of reflects a change in mentality and mission in a way. Like, the exhibits now are thinking what makes the most sense, would be the most comfortable for the animals, for the viewer, the most, like a real natural environment. So
I love that. I think I've as you describe it, I feel like if I think back, I do recall the change. I do recall what zoos looked like as a child, and it's very different than what I remember, more recently, and in a more, like you said, natural habitat, a little slice of that ecosystem instead of just being in a display box almost.
Yeah, right. And again, talking about being a mission-driven organization, you see how that mission, filters down into the built environment. And zoos now look a lot different because the whole focus and mentality and mission behind them has changed.
Wonderful. Colley, thank you so much for being my guest. Any kind of last takeaways you want our listeners to to remember?
I think just come out and see what we have going on at the zoo. It's a great chance to spend a day outdoors and to save animals just by visiting the zoo. So that's what I'd leave them with.
Thank you.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Greenbuild. Use the promo code DECODED for $50 off at greenbuildexpo.com. See the description for details.